Over the course of human history, militaries of the world have succeeded or failed based on the security of their communications. Join us for the next in our speaker series held in the stunning oldest naval chapel in the nation. As the afternoon sun streams through our priceless collection of Tiffany stained glass windows, you will hear author Ralph Simpson explain the role of cryptology in that history, what it is, and how it has impacted the world. You will also be able to see and touch a captured German Enigma machine from World War II. During the Cold War, spy submarines secretly operated from Mare Island. A man who later turned traitor and sold our Navy's cryptographic codes to the enemy served here. And Mare Island was home to an ultra-secure cryptographic school. Now, please sit back and enjoy historian and author Ralph Simpson's fascinating presentation on cryptology and the history of the cracking of the famous Nazi Enigma machine.
Exciting events that we're going to have in the next 2 months. One is on March 9th. It's called Open Mare Island, where you can walk around or drive on a self-guided tour of the island. It's going to start at the Quarters Coffee Shop, where we're going to give out a free cup of coffee. And you get a map of the island, and you can just walk around and see historical sites that we have. Next, on March 16th, here at the chapel, we're going to have music at the chapel, and it's going to be a celebration of St. Patrick's Day. We're going to have an Irish singer, Robert Scott. He's going to perform traditional Irish tunes, and after his concert, here next to the chapel, we're going to have a beer garden open for everyone to enjoy. And on April 13th, back here again, we're going to have a speaker series event, The Magic of the Organ. That's our wonderful organ over there. And we're going to have two individuals. One is going to describe the history of the organ, and the other one is going to do musical demonstration of the organ. And then on May 4th, we're going to have Viona. It's a choir, and they're going to present Voices of Unity, where they'll host a children's choir. And that's our next 2 months events. We're going to have more after that. But if you want further information or to buy tickets, please go to our website, which is mihpf.org. And I'm going to go over our speaker series event today, Cryptology. But I'm going to first, before I do that, I'm going to go over some housekeeping items. So in case of an emergency, there's 3 emergency exits. The first one is the front door that you came through, and there's 2 other exits, one here and one here. And then most importantly, bathrooms. There's 2 bathrooms available. There's a small one here, and there's one across the street, a porta potty. And please, no food or drinks minus water. Okay, now let's get to our featured event. Cryptology. Our speaker is Mr. Ralph Simpson.
Hello.
He worked in the computer industry for 32 years, working at IBM and Cisco Systems. He started as a systems engineer for a large mainframe computer and held a variety of technical and management roles, including authoring an IBM technical manual on redundant systems. He retired as a senior director for service strategy at Cisco Systems with responsibility for over 2,500 engineers. As a retiree, he now volunteers at the History of San Jose and the Computer History Museums. He wrote a book, which he has here for sale. It's called Crypto Wars, 2,000 Years of Cipher Evolution. He also is an avid collector of cipher machines, which you can see on his website, cipherhistory.com. He lives in a restored Victorian house in San Jose, which is home to his Cipher History Museum, and also home to his understanding wife. So without further ado, Mr. Ralph Simpson.
Is this on?
Yeah. Oh, that's just for the audio. You still have to speak in that.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Very good. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here. What a fantastic location you guys have here. Hopefully you can see all this, and I'll try not to get in the way, but I hate to stand, too confined here. So anyways, the talk is going to be about the Enigma machine, both the history and the technology of it. And being that this is a fairly small group, I'll welcome questions as I give the talk. If something comes up that you want to have a question about, please interrupt me. So I'm going to start. Many of you will know that the Enigma machine was made famous by the Nazis in World War II. But the origin of the Enigma machine was actually World War I. And a lot of people don't know the history of this. And so I want to go through why and how the Enigma machine was actually invented. And part of the reason was what you see on the right here are two Enigma manual devices. These were the main types of devices used in World War I. The one on top is a code book. That's a U.S. Army code book. And so it just substitutes words for numbers, and that's what you send. Typically, you don't use these in war. And the reason is if somebody captures your code book, you're screwed. Somebody can read every message, and you will never know. And that's why you see right on the front of this, it says, memorize this phrase, in this case, DAM, which means code is lost. So if you misplace your code book, or you get overrun and you have to leave and you find out you didn't take your code book, you quickly send the message DAM, everybody knows, throw away that code book, use the next one. Now, what that means is and even if it wasn't stolen, after 2 weeks, it was thrown away and they used the next code book. Now, in World War I, this was quite a task to do, to print up all these code books. Now, the second one is a Visionaire wheel. A Visionaire wheel just uses a code word, and then you spin the dial and change each letter. Now, you may think that these were fairly strong ciphers, but they really weren't. In fact, in 1917, the U.S. Army Signal Corps officer, the chief general in charge of all signal codes, said that his cryptographers could decode a message on Visionaire faster than the enemy can decode their own message. That's how weak it was. And yet, this is from World War I. We still used it, only because there was nothing else. These two were pretty much it. And so, what caused this thing to happen? Both of these, by the way, were 450 and 500 years old. So they've been used for a long time. And in fact, in 1863, it was published how to break this bottom code systematically. There was a published document. So there was no secrets that it could be broken. And so during World War I, every single country involved knew that their messages were being broken. They knew it, but they had no choice. There wasn't anything else they could do. And the reason that they were all broken was because they were all intercepted because of the radio. World War I was the first war that used the radio. And before that, to intercept a message, it was very difficult. Maybe you'd intercept a few because there's some couriers. Maybe you'd intercept some on a telegraph line. But you're not going to intercept every message going to every location. And that's what happened in World War I. And by having every message, all secrets were pretty much gone. So this was a problem. And so what happened was it caused, as often happens, times of war causes innovation. And the innovation in cryptology was immense. So up until this time, 450 years, they were still using the same codes. And then all of a sudden, in the span of just a few years of World War I, a bunch of new technologies came out. And I've listed some up there, and there's even more. But one is the one-time telegraph. It was invented in 1917 by AT&T. Okay, the cipher wheel, which is a device that has a bunch of wheels that you can mix up letters. both manual, the strip cipher, a burst encoder in order to send a message very fast. The first burst encoder was invented during World War I, and one of the early messages was sent to a U-boat commander, and the message was very short. And on a burst encoder, that meant it got sent in less than a second, and it just said, "Get Lucy." That was the message to sink the Lusitania. So that was one of the early uses of the burst encoder. And then the following 4 electromechanical ciphers were invented. This is what we're here to talk about today. The difference on these is that this is the use of electricity in a cipher device, and the electricity goes through a rotor. Now the one on the left here is an interesting one. That one is from a picture in the NSA Museum. It only has one wheel. The thing in the center is one wheel. And so it works sort of like an Enigma machine. You press a keyboard key and a light lights up after going through the rotor. And if you want to decode, you take the wheel out, spin it around, and put it back in. And then you can decode. This was invented by Edward Hubbard in Oakland. He said he figured this out while he was in jail. He was in jail for stealing a horse. And then in 1917, he was the first of these 4 to come up with a design, which is very beautiful, I think, brass right there. He built a manufacturing building, which you can still see in downtown Oakland. It takes up a full block, and it's beautiful. It cost $450,000 in 1920 to build this building. He was planning on hiring 1,500 workers, but it turned out he only made about 100 of these devices and then went bankrupt and was thrown in jail again for defrauding his investors. Now the one we're going to talk about is the Arthur Scherbius one, the next one. Now, that one doesn't look like the Enigma machine that I brought here. It looks more like a typewriter, but it's a heavy-duty typewriter. It weighs over 100 pounds. Okay, so it wasn't the one that would be portable for an army use. And in fact, it never really sold. We don't know of any that exist, in fact. That's just a picture of one. Hugo Koch was a guy out of the Netherlands who was also an inventor. He patented a device. Here's one of his patent drawings, but he never made any. So he kind of was not viewed as all that important in this story. And then the last one is Arvid Dam out of Sweden. He built one that you can see here. He didn't sell a lot of these either, but his company went on to then develop a new type of cipher device that ended up being the most prolific cipher device in world history. And that was the Cryptology Hagelin device, if you're familiar with that. The U.S. used it in World War II. So anyways, these are the 4 main devices. And so let me tell you the classic story. This is the history of the Enigma machine. And if you go on the internet now, this is what you'll read about. The guy on the left is Arthur Scherbius, engineer out of Germany, who is given credit for inventing this machine. And the guy on the right is this guy, Hugo Koch out of the Netherlands, that I said never built one. Well, these 2 were known to collaborate on other machines. So there was always suspicions that they both worked together on the Enigma. And they both ended up patenting this device. And the German Navy began testing the Scherbius machine in 1926. And after he got the contract to start testing, he went to Koch the following year and bought his patent rights for, at the time, $350. It was 600 guilders. May not sound like a lot of money, but this is, 1926. That's still a fair amount of money. And but the question was always, why would he pay Koch for patent rights for a patent that he also owns? It seemed a little strange. Koch's patent was a little earlier, so that might explain it. But it was still curious. And it turns out the following year, Koch died of a long-running illness. And the year after that, Scherbius died. They were both in their 50s, late 50s, so he died in a horse carriage accident. So, it was rather unexpected. And neither would know the importance of the Enigma machine to world history. But here I wanted to talk about the patents, because this is an important point. The one on top is the Hugo Koch patent. And you can see he filed it in 1919. Okay, and this was in October of 1919. He filed it first. Before it was public, before anybody knew about this, Scherbius filed the exact same patent. And if you take the 6 pages of the patent and translate it from Dutch to German, you would get Scherbius's patent. And if you take the 10 drawings and maybe scale them differently, you get the exact same engineering drawings. So you know that can't happen by accident. This was definitely a copy. And so now the question of why he bought the patent rights is maybe it was thanks, for that collaboration, because Koch did file his patent first. And so maybe he's just giving a thank you. The other is that they could have been doing this on purpose to circumvent the Versailles Treaty. The Versailles Treaty says that Germans are not supposed to develop weapons of war. And this is considered a weapon of war. And so they each assigned their patents to a company that sounded similar. Veritas, cipher machine or something like that. And so I think it was just maybe to confuse the matter that they could develop this. But here's where things changed in 2003. So, just 22 years ago, it was discovered that these 2 Dutch naval officers, they claimed to have invented this Enigma machine. And they claimed this back in 1919. And the story is that they were both working for the Dutch Navy. They had the machine built. They tested it. The Navy liked it and used it, but they did not want it patented because this is still World War I and they didn't want this technology to get out. So they would not allow them to patent it. Meanwhile, they went ahead and hired a patent attorney, and they gave him one of these Enigma machines and their patent drawings and said, we want to patent this when we're allowed to. Finally, a few months after the war ended, they were allowed to patent it. And what they found was the patent was denied. And the reason the patent was denied was that the patent was already assigned to the patent attorney's brother-in-law. Now, these guys didn't know that was his brother-in-law. He had a different name. So they didn't know how to fight this, and they ended up losing the lawsuit. So that was the story. But now these 2, surprisingly, are assigned the owners of the invention of the Enigma machine, and they beat Hagelin by a couple of years. So they did this in 1915. So I have to update that last chart I showed you with the 4 inventions, and I'm taking out Hagelin. I have Hagelin, but he's no longer the first, he's the second. And the first is that first invention by Hugo Koch, but really it's the 2 Dutch naval officers that did that. So those are the 3 Enigma-type machines that were invented all during World War I. So here's the machine that you see up here, and I encourage you to come take a look if you haven't seen it. It gives you a real sense of how this works when you actually see it in operation. And good old German engineering, 85-year-old machine, and I haven't done anything to it other than put some oil and grease on it, and it still works great. Anyways, this is it. The heart and soul of the machine are those 3 rotors you see in the center, which mixes up the encryption, and I'll describe all that. And then on the lower right, you see the plug board. Okay, this is what the German military added beyond what Scherbius and Koch had come up with. And they figured this would add a lot more encryption strength that did not exist. So this is the machine. And some people ask me, what is that on the front flap that falls down? Klappe schließen? Any Germans here, or people know German?
Close the cover.
Close the flap, right? Flappe. So yes, close the cover. And what happens is when you close the cover, it covers up those plugs. But what it also does is it makes sure that the plugs are all pushed in far enough that they activate. Because if they're not quite all the way in, it'll screw up the encryption. But I understand, maybe you can help me on this, I was told that it could also have a double entendre meaning of keep your flap closed.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true? Okay. So I thought that was a rather clever way to do it. Close the flap or close your flap. Okay, and if you open that upper lid, and for those of you that came by to see it, you'll recognize this. You can see better what's under the covers. Up at the top are the three rotors. Each of the three rotors will encrypt a letter and change it. And then on the left of that, you can barely see the red B there. That's a reflector. It reflects the signal, the electrical signal back, and it goes each time to the plug board, and then it goes to the light bulb and lights up a light bulb. So the operation of it is electrically fairly simple. It goes through a circuitous route, but at the end it's like a flashlight. You know, you press a button and the light lights up. And so somebody has to write down what letter that is. So now I'm going to show you how it works. And this is a electrical wiring. I tried to make it as correct as possible. So the plug board's on the bottom, the reflector's on the top, and so everything is lined up just like that. That's the entire wiring of the machine. And now I'm going to go through an example. I'm going to press the letter A. Okay, so that's on the keyboard. I press the letter A, and the first thing that's going to happen, look at the top. The first thing that's going to happen are the rotors are going to rotate. And it may just be 1, 2, or 3 rotors. They rotate like an odometer. So they're going to rotate. So physically, they rotate first. Then what happens is, as you push down on that letter A, it makes an electrical connection to the battery. And so here's the battery. An electrical connection starts flowing, and the first place it goes to is the plug board. And you can see it goes to the A plug on the plug board. Now, if there's no plug in the A plug, it will just go on up to the rotors as an A. But in this example, I'm showing that it does have a plug there, and the plug goes to an M. So now, after pressing the A, the letter is changed to an M. The M is what goes up to the top. It goes through the entry drum, and then it goes through the 3 rotors. And those 3 rotors are going to change that letter 3 times, and it hits the reflector. The reflector will reflect it back, which changes it, and then it's going to go back through the 3 rotors 3 more times. So that's all happening, you know, with this one letter. Then it comes back to the plug board, and in this example, it comes back as an O. There happens to be a plug there, which changes it to an H, and now what happens is it finalizes the electrical connection, and the H bulb lights up. Yes?
Is the rotation of the 3 rotors random?
It's not random, but it's settable. Okay, so there's a notch in each one, and that notch can be turned in 26 different positions. And so, and that's one of the settings, the daily settings. So, you know, depending on where it's set, it will then rotate the next wheel.
So you have to know the daily setting to decode?
Yes, yes. Unless you have a bomb to break it, like which we'll discuss. So this is how it works, and you know, it took me weeks to put together this slide. So I hope you appreciate the amount of work. I can tell you before doing this, my skills at PowerPoint was simply just making words and putting. I've never done animation like this, so I had to figure that out. Yes.
What's to stop the daily setting from getting into an enemy's hands?
Nothing. And sometimes it did. And in fact, that's how it was broken. So, yes.
How reliable was the machine in the field?
It was very reliable, very reliable. I mean, there would be times where, things could go wrong, and there's even that little tag in the lid that tells you how to keep it clean and, how to oil it and how to use some emery cloth on the connections. But for a mechanical device like this, it's surprisingly reliable. I mean, you can come up here and try it. I press each key a number of times each month just to keep it, active, and it doesn't fail. It just works every time. Yes?
So the diagram, when you press an A
Yes.
like that, the H light goes on,
Yep.
and you would write down the letter H
Yes.
to pass on in a piece of paper to the next, and then I'm sure you're going to show us how to decode that and fill it in.
Exactly. That's exactly what would happen. So there's no printer on this. Somebody, and usually it's not the person typing. There's another person sitting beside them that's writing down the letters so that it can go faster. Yes.
So there are 26 possibilities for each letter.
Yes. Yes. Although I said that a little bit fast. The one possibility that is excluded is the letter itself. So if I press an A, the A cannot light up, and it's because of the engineering on this. You can see that it's coming back, and it has to be something other than an A because of the way the reflector design is. And this is the little wedge. You wouldn't think that's much of a wedge, but that's the wedge that Turing used to break the Enigma. So, yes.
Well, everybody's familiar with the ciphers and the zodiac.
Yeah.
So was that just a simple where he made a symbol and it meant something? You just had to figure out what the
No.
symbol was?
No, if it was that simple, it would have been broken, within minutes. That would be, that's what, we would. It would be called a monoalphabetic cipher. Those are very simple. It doesn't matter what the symbol is. If you can just try different. There's only, it sounds like there's a lot of possibilities because there's 26 factorial ways to arrange that. But because of the way the English alphabet works, they know the frequency of different letters and so forth, which was discovered in 1850, by the way. 850. So it was known for over 1,000 years how to break that kind of cipher. So this cipher that he used was called polyalphabetic, so it would change for each letter. And you had to know what causes the change. So, yes.
Sorry, one more question. So it's rather cumbersome to send a message. You have to hunt for a letter, somebody has to write it down, and so it's not instantaneous.
No, there's no radio in this, right? So this is just a standalone machine, and I'll show you an example of that. But yes, it's quite laborious to send messages this way. Yes.
How do they handle punctuation and space?
Yeah, that's another thing that adds more complication because there's only 26 letters, so there's no punctuation, no space bar, no special characters. The receiver had to kind of figure it out, so they would just string together all these words, and they would have to. And then when they were written out, before they got sent to the person that's really going to act on this, they would have to separate it out into the message. And they're sometimes told to purposely misspell words, use different words for that could mean the same thing. They'd spell out numbers. If it's unclear if that space should be in that word, they have to write the word stop, for instance. So it was not that simple a thing to just send a message. They had to be very, very careful about it. So let's talk about the strength of this Enigma. Remember, this is the first device using electricity. So this is brand new. Before the times of Enigma and some of the other devices from World War I, in fact, the types of people you would hire to break Enigma codes would be someone that was good with a crossword puzzle. Somebody that knew the language. So if you knew German, that would be important. And what we found out after World War I was language isn't even important. The American cryptologists that broke the Japanese cipher didn't even know the language, but they broke the cipher. Okay, so it's what's important for the first time is mathematics. That was the key to breaking these. So let's talk about the settings. the theoretical maximum number of settings that if you take an Enigma machine, just the standard Enigma machine with 3 rotors, it's 3 out of 5, and all the different settings that you have, the number of settings is 3 times 10 to the 114th. Now, for those of you that are not real mathematically inclined, that means it's a number with 114 zeros after it. We're talking about a huge number. In fact, I was happy to give this talk to Google once and said, here's a natural way we've come up with a number bigger than a Google. So this is a huge number, right? And in fact, the number of atoms in the universe is only 10 to the 80. So we're talking about millions and billions of universes worth of atoms. So this is a huge number. Now the enemy that captures the Enigma has less that he has to work on. So one of the things you do in cryptography is you assume your enemy's captured your machine. Because in times of war, the enemy is going to capture your machine. And so if he captures your machine, he knows the wiring of the rotors. He knows exactly how it works. He knows the wiring of the reflector. And so that gets rid of a lot of these combinations that otherwise you wouldn't know. And now it brings down that number to 10 to the 23. Now that's a lot lower than 10 to the 114. But you have to put this in times of World War I and II. This is a huge number. What we would call today a 76-bit key. And a 76-bit key is not the same as what you're used to today, maybe 256 or 512 or whatever it is. But in these days, this was huge. The first computer standard came out in 1976, and it was called DES, and it had 56-bit key. It was still the computer standard until 2001. So having a 76-bit key much earlier is quite a strong encryption. And so what I'm trying to impress upon you, I think, is because a lot of people say, why didn't the Germans know that their Enigma was broken? Well, I think this is the reason. And the reason is they tried to break it themselves and they couldn't. They saw that the enemy had something that was similar to that. They didn't even try to break it because they knew it couldn't be broken. And here's one way to look at it. I've come up with a kind of a way to think trying to get in the German mind how they thought it might be broken. They thought that if you took 100,000 operators, so let's say you had a city of operators, and you built 100,000 of these machines, and you put a person in front of each one, and you gave them a message to break. And let's say they could change a setting once a second and test that setting in 1 second. Now, of course, you can't do it that fast, but let's assume you can do all that. How long would it take to break this cipher if you have a 76-bit key? How long?
Decades.
Decades? Would you believe twice the age of the universe? That's how long it would take. Yes?
So there are 3 rotors, so each has a setting, and I guess it's 26 times 26 times 26.
Yes.
Where does the rest of that come from? Is it the plug board?
The plug board gives most of it, yes. So you're right. You know, if you only had the 3 rotors to turn, there's actually another thing about the turnover switch can be on any of 26 positions on that too. And then they could all be set in 26 different positions around the.
So the reflector is set separately too.
Yeah, but that's fixed. So it has no cryptologic strength at all, as far as this calculation. Yeah, and it was never changed during the war. So, which they could have, but they never did. So this is I think what you have to keep in mind for the Germans. They were thinking this is just not going to be broken, and so they didn't try to break the enemies, and they figured theirs was safe. Some people asked about exactly how it was used. Here's a good example, because what you can see here, you see this person here is a radio operator. Here is the Enigma operator, and here's the guy that's writing down the signals. So it takes 3 people to send a message. And usually they're not just in some back hut doing it. You notice here, this is General Guderian. He's in charge of the Panzer tanks. He's waiting for that message because he's standing there on the communication truck. And over his shoulder, you can see this guy here is probably some officer waiting to get that message and deliver it to the field. So these people are under pressure. Remembering now, they're probably 19, 20 years old. You know, they're in times of war. Bombs are going off, and they're having to cipher and decipher messages with all of that pressure on them. And you can see the Enigma machine right here. So that's the Enigma operator, and that's the machine. So how was it broken? I'm going to talk about Alan Turing, but I first want to talk about the first person to break it. It wasn't Alan Turing, it was this guy. And this guy was a recent college grad, and he had a master's in mathematics in Poland. He didn't know anything about cryptology. He just knew mathematics, pure mathematics, but he was brilliant. And so the Polish, in the 1930s, it was 1932, they brought him on board, gave him a quick class, as well as two other colleagues of his, and he was given the task of breaking the Enigma machine. Okay, at the time, they didn't know what the wiring of the rotors were. They didn't know anything, but based on the messages they were getting, they figured this was not the commercial Enigma because it looked like there was a swapping going on, like with the plug board. So they kind of figured out there was a plug board involved, just based on the messages. But he was given that task, and it turns out he was able to break it because there was a German spy, there was a German in the Cipher Bureau in Germany who was willing to sell out some messages. Now, he didn't give the wiring of the Enigma. What he gave to the French some messages and some settings. So they could see the settings, they could see the messages, and the French had that and could not figure it out. They gave it to the English. Now, this was before Turing's time. They gave it to the English couldn't figure it out. They gave it to this guy, and within a month, he had all the wiring figured out, he figured out how to break it, and he broke the Enigma machine for the next 7 years without telling his colleagues, without telling the French or the English. And the reason was they were afraid that if they told them that the word would get out and the Germans would change the Enigma machine. So they kept that secret until 5 weeks before the war broke out. Then they brought the French and the English into Warsaw, showed them the Enigma machine that they made, which looked much like that, but they had the plug board in the back instead of the front because they didn't know what it really looked like. And they showed them the bombs that they built, which were at the time just desktop machines to break the Enigma. They would typically break the Enigma in about 15 minutes every day.
Wow.
And they were reading all the German messages.
Did they happen to intercept the order to invade Poland?
I'm not sure that there was. I think they had radio silence, believe it or not, just before that. But they had enough messages and enough traffic to even know that there had to be something going on. And just before that invasion, the Germans changed some of their things. For instance, they, instead of having 6 to 8 plug boards, they used 10 cables. And then they added 2 new wheels. And so they did some things to throw it off. And it meant that the Polish could not decipher every message. They were only deciphering about 10%. But they already knew, and that's why they invited their allies in to help break this. Oh, and one of the things I forgot to mention is some people ask, why was it called the bomb? Because you think of bomb as an explosion, right? Well, the Polish were the first ones to name it bomba, and that's a question. Why was it called bomba? Some people thought, well, they were probably at this ice cream parlor and they were eating a ice cream treat called a bomba, and they came up with the idea and just called it a bomba. I find that a little bit hard to believe. Others said, well, it sounds like a bomb. because of the way it operates, it makes all this clicking noise, you know, and like a bomb ticking. Well, that's the English bomb. The Polish bomb didn't do that. So I think, and this is just my own speculation, that it's the same thing as what we in America call, that's the bomb. That's a great idea. And so I asked some people from Poland if that's what it means, and they said, yeah, I thought everybody knew that. So that's it. It just means it. And somebody specifically asked Rejewski why he named it the bomb. And he wrote his answer. And his answer was, we couldn't come up with a better name. So no enlightenment there. So here's Bletchley Park. Have any of you been to Bletchley Park? Very good. Very good. If any of you have a chance, it's only an hour train ride north of London. I would definitely recommend it. It's a fabulous. I mean, this is just the main building, but they have all these huts, they're called, that have lots of Enigma and other devices there, and they'll tell the whole story of breaking the Enigma. They had about 11,000 people at Bletchley Park during the war, breaking Enigmas every day. And so you probably all know the story of Alan Turing. He's the hero in The Imitation Game. If you've seen the Benedict Cumberbatch movie, if you haven't, please see that movie. It's great. It really tells the story. And so it was all this was led by Alan Turing. He came up with the bomb. The bomb simulates 36 Enigmas working in series, and they built 210 of these devices. So it's not just one like they showed in The Imitation Game. There were 210, and there were thousands of women running these machines. It was all women that ran them. And here's Alan Turing. The bomb that you see on the right is a U.S. bomb. It's not the English bomb. That U.S. bomb you can see at Fort Meade, outside of D.C. in the U.S. And so the U.S. built the bomb, and you can see there's 4 rotors, that are horizontally. Those 4 rotors represent the 4 rotors of the naval Enigma, because it had 4 rotors. And so this was had to be much faster device in order to break the codes in the same kind of time frame. Yes?
Your previous slide said in series.
Yes.
In series instead of in parallel?
Let's see. I think it's in series.
Okay.
It's in series because it's checking every single one at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. You wouldn't think they would, but it had this parallel board, and that's how the parallel board worked. It had to work in series instead of in parallel, because otherwise it would be going back and forth to the parallel board each time.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
NCR, what does it stand for?
National Cash Register.
That's what I thought.
Dayton, Ohio, right?
They made the,
Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember the cash registers at the grocery store, punching the keys.
Yeah, tell me about it. Yeah. So, the guy that invented this on the right-hand side, by the way, here was the tricky thing. The English bomb, the rotors would spin around at a rate of 120 times per minute. Okay? And so once it got a hit, as it's spinning, it thought it got a hit, the wheel would stop, and there would be a little pointer on it to point to one of the 26 letters around the periphery. And that would work, because you have to think in terms of, okay, it takes a minute, and this thing is going to go around in a minute, 120 times, right? Twice a second. So it can stop in 1/26th of the rotation. This one, they designed it so that it would break the Enigma in about the same amount of time. Their time frame was they wanted to break it within 12 hours. And in order to do that, this thing had to spin at 17,000 and something, I think, 1,740 times per minute. And if you stop that, you can't stop it in a 26th of a time. It would just fry up the machine, right? C is the bearings and all that kind of stuff. So the guy that invented this, they gave it to the person that came up with a design for a thyratron. Are you guys familiar with a vacuum tube called well, it's not a vacuum tube, it's a thyratron, it's a gas-filled tube. And the thing about a thyratron is it has an electrical signal that's either on or off. And it can switch on or off very fast. And so this guy actually came up with this tube that would switch on very fast, and it was used to count nuclear decay for the atom bomb. So this was all a big secret, and he didn't even know what it was used for. But he knew that this would count atomic decay or anything else very quickly. Well, he needed that on this machine. And if you take a look at the top of this machine, there's this big box here that holds thousands of tubes, power tubes and thyratrons. And the whole purpose of that box is to keep track of all of the positions of all of these wheels, so that if there's a hit, instead of stopping, it could just keep going and slow down and eventually stop, and it'll spin around about 4 or 5 times. But it's stored away what that setting was based on this thyratron, and it would print it out right here. This is a printer. So all it needed was 4 letters, 4 bytes of information. That's what this whole thing up here is. That's the first storage device, electronic storage device, and invented in order to solve this machine.
Oh, sir, can you go back one? Why were they all destroyed?
I think part of the reason was the US and the UK wanted to convince people to use the Enigma machine after the war. And they were used after the war, and they would use these bombs to decode the messages. So for instance, the machine I have here was used by the Norway secret police, which is their CIA. And it was used all the way through the 50s and into the 60s until they got suspicions that their messages were being read. And it turns out they were. So the US and England were both reading their messages and sharing what they found. They also gave these machines to a lot of countries. India, Israel, all of the Middle East, and they even, on their own dime, put the letters into Arabic and all kinds of things to convince people to use it so that they could then decode the message. So at some point they had to destroy these so that the word wouldn't get out. But I think by the time they destroyed them, it was 1955, they already had computers that could break it. So they didn't need these. Yes?
Just a question on the reliability of the bomb with all those tubes.
Yeah.
Was that a problem?
It wasn't that much of a problem, but the tubes would go out, and so the operators were typically women, but the repair people were typically men, and they would have their bundle of tubes and wires and things like that to replace. The first use of this, of these tubes, was actually this next device I was going to talk about. This one on the left, the Colossus. It had 2,400 tubes, and vacuum tubes and thyratrons. And the thought was that this would not, it wouldn't last long enough before a bulb would burn out based on 2,400 and the time and the length of time they last. But what they found was if they kept power to them all the time, they would last. So they had a pretty good life expectancy, more than was even expected. But not enough that you can't go on eBay right now and buy some of these thyratron tubes and power tubes that would actually, from World War II, I have some, dated 1942, 1943, whatever, that could be used in these types of devices. So the reason I'm bringing this up is that this is at Bletchley Park, and a lot of people talk about this being the first programmable computer, and it is. It's quite impressive, but this did not break the Enigma machine. Okay, so I don't want you to get this confused, like I see a lot of people online thinking this breaks the Enigma machine. This was built to break this machine, which is a 10-wheel Lorenz cipher machine. and it was used to as part of a teletype system. And it was broken with this Lorenz, but it's a different story. And so this is not the Enigma story. Okay, I don't want to leave this on there, and somebody thinks that's part of the Enigma story. But here's what the heart and soul of this whole Enigma story is about, and it's about the U-boat peril. I like this quote from Winston Churchill. He said, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." Now you have to imagine, he was thinking the Germans are going to invade, the UK. He was thinking they got these B-1 rockets bombing London, and the only thing that really frightened him was the U-boat peril. And that's because he knew that if they succeeded in that, there would be no hope for maintaining England. And so, and to give you a sense for that, you can see this, by the way, is not a photo; it's a painting. But before the U.S. entered the war, the U-boats were sinking on average about 60 ships per month, at a cost of thousands of lives, material, and humanitarian food supplies and so forth for the UK. And the reason for this was that the Germans had this strategy called the wolf pack, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. They would have submarines scattered all across the shipping lanes of the Atlantic. As soon as a convoy was found, instead of just bombing a couple of ships and running, they would radio back to Germany and said, "I found this convoy, here's the location," so that they would know all the submarines in the vicinity. And they would round them up, bring them to bear, and they would each take a different ship or a couple of ships that they want to sink, and they would do it all at the same time. And typically these wolf packs would be a dozen U-boats. The biggest U-boat wolf pack that we know about was about 40. So you can imagine the devastation that this caused to the shipping. And so, yes?
I'd always heard the Queen Mary was always targeted by the subs, but it was so fast they couldn't get the torpedoes out. Is that true?
I'm not sure. I have not heard that. I'm not sure why the Queen Mary survived all that. I don't know. Okay, now another thing is the Enigma machine was broken, from the very beginning of the war, even before the war, by the Polish. But the Navy's encipherment using their methods was never broken until 1941. And so they had the same machine. Okay, at first, they had the three-wheel Enigma. The three-wheel Enigma was not broken. And you may ask, why wasn't that broken? Well, for one thing, the Navy was much more stringent on their use of the cipher machine. So, for instance, the way the Army and the Air Force did it, there's three wheel settings, and when you send a message, you had to set this on any of the 26 letters. And what you would do is you'd send the 26 letters, and then when you hit those three letters, it would decipher to something else, and you'd send the decipherment. And because these are 19, 20, 21-year-old kids, they tend to use things like their girlfriend's initials. There's one girl that was called Lily. So he would send L-I-L-L-I-E. And others would use words like Hitler or Berlin or London. So if you see a message that starts with L-O-N, you can think that the encryption was D-O-N. And then that helps you figure out what the wheels are. Now, in the Navy, they didn't allow that. They said, here are the settings you're going to use. And by the way, each U-boat would have a different setting. So they wouldn't just use one setting for everybody. And they took it very seriously. So for instance, everybody had to change their settings at midnight. So they're giving a monthly set of settings. At midnight, they change the setting. One U-boat operator sent a message, and after he sent it, he realized it was just after midnight. So he made a mistake. It's not a killer mistake, you know, but it's a mistake. Then what he did was he sent the same message using the new setting. Now that's a big mistake, because now the cryptanalysts now have two messages, and it has two different settings, and that's how they are able to break the cipher. And of course, the Germans are watching all this in headquarters. They saw what happened. They ordered the U-boat back to port. They demoted the captain, and they put in jail this operator. So that's how serious they were about this. But here's how the Allies were first able to break the U-boat cipher. The guy on the left here is the captain of the U-boat. He was well liked by I think he was like 26 years old in 41 when this happened. But he was well liked by his crew. He had already earned the Iron Cross. And he was bombing some convoys, and his U-boat was bombed, and he had to surface. Now, the English had a plan. When they had a U-boat surface, and they saw that it was in trouble, they would start firing automatic fire at the conning tower to force the sailors out quick. So they knew they had to hurry up and leave. And maybe they would forget to set the scuttling charges that would sink the U-boat. And that's exactly what happened. And so they were retrieving all these German soldiers, and around the back came this little boat carrying this guy on the right, as well as a whole party. And you can see that party right here. They're on the U-boat that's sinking, but the scuttling charges weren't set. They went in and retrieved the code books and some Enigma machines. And in the Navy, they instead of having 1 month's worth of code settings, they'd have 3 months, because they'd have to be resupplied in 3 months. So this allowed them to read the previous month's worth of settings and the next 2 months' setting in real time. And this was the first. This became the turning point, because now they understood how they enciphered messages and so forth. So this allowed the English for the first time to continuously reroute these convoys, because all these U-boats were sending back their position locations every day. And so they could see, they plotted out exactly where these subs were, and they would just avoid them. And it completely changed the war. Then they found out that these unarmed weather trawlers, which are in the North Sea, also had Enigma machines. Now, why they felt the need to encrypt weather reports, I don't know, but they did. So what the English did was they would attack one of these weather trawlers about every 3 months when it was fairly new and they would sink it, but not before taking the code books. And so they did that several times throughout the war, and they were able to then get the next code settings. And you can see here what happened. This completely turned around the war. The number of U-boats that were sunk exceeded the number of ships they were sinking. So they ended up having to depart the Atlantic. And it didn't happen in a smooth curve, but you can see sort of what happened. You can see where the U-110 was, and then immediately after that, because the next 3 months we had all their codes, we knew how to reroute the traffic. And so you can see for the 3 months after the capture, we knew how to reduce it. But then shortly after that, we didn't know the next month, and then the four-rotor Enigma came out, and we couldn't break that one. And so therefore, the number of Allied shipping losses were huge again. Then we finally get a first break in the four-wheel Enigma. Not totally, but we got a break of some, and then at some point, the U-boats exited the Atlantic because they were losing more U-boats than they were sinking ships. Yes?
I read that the British wouldn't allow the secret information to be used unless they could confirm it from another source, so the Germans wouldn't figure out.
Yes, exactly. That's brought out in the imitation game, and there's a good reason for that. If the Germans thought that this was being broken, they could easily change their Enigma machine in some way. Even if they just rewired the wheels, that would have made it much more difficult for quite a while, to break. So they, whenever they thought that there was or they knew where a U-boat was going to be, rather than just bomb it, they would put a spotter plane over it, and then they knew where to put the spotter plane, but then they'd have a boat ready to bomb it and sink the subs, rather than just do it without any other warning. So here's Donance. He was the admiral in charge of the U-boats, and he's inspecting a new U-boat that's about to go out to the Atlantic on battle. And that's exactly my next point. They exploited the Enigma after they had a deception of traditional sources. And in fact, this brings up several examples, I think, where you could think that the Germans should have known regardless. So for instance, Rommel, the general in Africa he called himself the Desert Fox, because he always happened to be at the right place at the right time. And that was because he was breaking the US ciphers. So he knew exactly where the English were going to be. Anyways, at some point, the English found this out, told the Americans to use a different cipher, and so now Rommel didn't know anymore. And at the same time, we were reading the Enigma messages. And so, being in Africa, he needed war supplies, like oil and gas, for his tanks and so forth. And so what the English would do, they didn't have enough planes to send down to the Mediterranean to keep bombing all these convoys. So what they would do is they'd have a convoy, and there could be a dozen or more ships involved. They would pick out the oil tankers and bomb them. And if they had time, they'd bomb others, but they definitely went first for the oil tankers. And so the way they did it was they did the spotter plane trick. They send a spotter plane, they'd see it, and then there'd happen to be a ship nearby, but they knew exactly the route it was taking and when it was going and everything. Now, there was one time that when the convoy left Naples, the port was overcast. So there was no way to send a spotter plane up there to see this convoy. And so they were positioned to bomb them, but there was no way to prove that there was a spotter plane that spotted them. So finally, as they got to the coast of Africa, there was a little hole in the clouds, and the spotter plane purposely flew into that cloud, into that hole, so that the people could see them, and then they bombed them. Now, this didn't really fool the Germans. So Hitler himself called a meeting with the admirals, the generals, the Cipher Bureau, everybody to say, the question's on the table, have the Allies broken the cipher machine, the Enigma machine? And of course, they said, twice the age of the universe, it's not possible. And they said, well, how could it have happened? And they could only come up with a couple other reasons. Coincidence, which nobody bought, or they thought it could be that there was a spy. Okay, so that's a possibility. So they sent that message around on an email. On a Enigma message. And so the Allies captured this Enigma message, and so they sent a message to a non-existent spy in Naples thanking him for telling us about this convoy, and we're going to give you a promotion and a bonus for this. Thank you very much. And so the Germans went through Naples, kicking in doors, trying to find this spy, which they never found, but they fired the admiral in charge of the Naples port because they really believed this. And so, nobody knew any different. Another example is 5 ships were identified in one Enigma message by this guy, Donance. He wanted to, encourage his troops. So he said, hey, there's 2 new U-boats going to be joining the fray in the North Atlantic. They're the latest version. They're going to be coming through the North Sea at this time and date. He gave a time and date when it was going to be entering the Atlantic. And he said, and 2 more U-boats are due to be resupplied. So every 3 months they have to be resupplied. And they're resupplied once at sea, so they're out for 6 months. Then they come into port for the next supply. And that resupply is for food, torpedoes, and of course oil, and the next 3 months worth of Enigma messages, settings. And so he said where this resupply was going to be, and the resupply was off the bulge of Africa, 1,000 miles from any of these convoy routes. And this is what they did. They would go 1,000 miles out of the way, just so that, because what would happen is they'd have this mother submarine, a huge one, that would come up to the surface. 2 smaller attack submarines would come on each side, and they'd be resupplied, and it'd take hours to supply all the oil they need and transfer all the food and so forth. So they were very vulnerable during that time, and they couldn't just disconnect because the oil connections are there. So anyways, we got this message, the English got this message and said, what do we do with this? It mentions 5 different submarines that we can attack. This mother sub and the 2 new subs that are coming into the Atlantic. Which ones should we attack? And they said, well, let's get the mother sub and the 2 attack subs, because the mother sub, is going to keep supplying other submarines out there, and let's make them come into port. So even though this is 1,000 miles from the shipping lanes, they sent a spotter plane over and they bombed and got all 3 submarines. Success, right? The bad news is a real spotter plane spotted the other 2. They bombed them and got those 2. So they got all 5 submarines identified in one Enigma message. So Hitler calls another meeting. How is this possible? And of course, they said the normal things like spies. In this case, they said it couldn't be spies, because this message came from Donitz, and he was there relaying it to the Enigma operator, which went out immediately. In fact, Donitz's second in command said he's done all the searching on this he can find, and he's come down to identifying the spy as one of 2 people, either me or you. And that's what he told him. So basically, they thought, okay, did they break the Enigma? Hitler thought they must have come up with a way to do sonar readings from the air, underground, into the water. And so he put a bunch of scientists on that task. He really thought that must be how the English are doing this. But it can't be from breaking the Enigma, right? And so they went on and kept, they didn't even change their monthly codes. They just kept going, And that's what happened there. Some people say, well, wait a minute. Donitz is the one that came out with the 4-wheel Enigma. Obviously, he thought that the 3-wheel Enigma wasn't strong enough then. Well, no, that isn't why he came up with it. What he did was he wanted to have a cipher that was different than all the other services, because he didn't trust the other services. That was the difference. And he was in jail, in fact, afterwards, and it was confirmed in an interview in 1974 that that's what he was thinking. He, by the way, took over for Hitler for 11 days as the Fuhrer. So, code breaking. The success of this code breaking, it started in 1932 from the Polish. It wasn't told to the public, at least the English-speaking public, until 1974. And there were thousands of people that knew this. Like I said, there were 11,000 that worked at Bletchley Park. We think there were tens of thousands, maybe 20,000 in the U.S. that worked on this, that broke the Enigma. And yet, can you imagine? To me, this is the biggest story of all of the Enigma story. How in the world do tens of thousands of people know this, and the word doesn't get out until 1974? There were cases of people that worked together, worked on this, and they both worked in Bletchley Park. They met after the war, and they didn't tell each other they worked at Bletchley Park breaking the Enigma until after 1974. And of course, the U.S. and the U.K. was encouraging this because they wanted other countries to use it. And then we were reading their messages, and like this one here from Norway. And in total, we think about 40,000 enigmas were manufactured, and today about 400 exist. And of those 400, about 200 are in private hands, 200 are in museums. Yes?
So is that considered affordable, or is it ever smaller than that?
Well, no.
The smallest one that exists?
There is a smaller one. There's a 3/4 size one, but it was different. It was 3/4 size and used by their intelligence service because they wanted to have a different Enigma. And it didn't have a plug board, but instead of moving like an odometer, it had a separate gearing that would cause the gears to move it in an irregular way. So it was actually not a bad encryption, but all the rest were this size, and it weighs 30 pounds. So, you know, I can imagine a soldier putting that on his back, carrying a rifle, carrying all of his other stuff. You know, it's quite a, and by the way, I also have the radio that they would have used with this. And the radio even weighs more, and then it has a battery that weighs a lot. And so I don't know how these guys did it, you know, carrying these things around in time of war. It's got to be very troublesome. Now, what would happen, and part of the reason for 40,000 turning to 400, you can imagine a lot of these just got blown up and so forth. The Germans were told to destroy them if their positions were overrun. So sometimes they would just put a grenade in it, and they'd put it in a lake. They'd put it in a hole and, you know, shoot at it. I know a collector that has one that the lamp board, which is made out of metal, has this unusual shape to it. It kind of goes in, and it has a wavy shape to it. And then a friend of his came over with a German World War II rifle, and he put the butt of the rifle there, and it exactly matched the shape of that thing. So they were just told to destroy it. Many times we'll find them with bullet holes in them, you know, that kind of thing. And you can, in some cases, you can find some that are quite rusted. You know, you can tell they're an enigma if you know what you're looking at, but otherwise it's just a pile of rust. You know, but those sell for thousands of dollars today. You know. In fact, you can go on eBay right now, and one rotor that's all torn up, it's partly eaten away, and about, you know, 3/4 of it exists. It's like $1,500. Yeah. Yes.
I've heard you mention the figure before, and I forgot it. But after the movie came out, the price of the Enigma machines didn't rocket up. They
rocketed up. I've got that next here. But one thing I have to mention first is David Hatch. He's an NSA historian. He's still there. I talked to him about the Enigma machines that were at the NSA. They have about 22 on display when I was there several years ago. And I said, oh, this is great. You know, there's no other place that has this number of Enigmas, you know. And he says, yeah. And he said, you know, there's 22. And he said, we have a few more, you know, in storage. And I said, well, how many more? He said, well, not many, you know, that's about it. I said, but that doesn't make sense, because during the war, the soldiers were told to capture these things and send them back. So I would have expected hundreds, if not thousands, of these things to have been captured. He said, well, when he joined the NSA, the museum, he was told a story that he thinks is probably true, that after the war, the Navy was going to bomb a ship as part of a naval practice of their ammunition, and it was a surplus ship, and they said, and we have room for some ballast in here. Normally, to destroy something like an Enigma costs money because it has to be very carefully destroyed. But he said, if you want to put some as ballast on this ship, we'll bomb it and send it to the bottom of the ocean. And so he said he has no proof, there's nothing documented, but he's heard that story enough that he thinks that's what happened to thousands of them. And so, and I did a quick calculation. One pallet of Enigma is 2 tons and 150 devices. And it's a standard pallet, you know, about 5 feet high. So that could account for what happened to a lot of Enigma machines. But here is a picture from the movie, The Imitation Game. And this came out in Christmas of 2014. And I would say that the very next Enigma that sold for double the price of the previous high-priced Enigma. I mean, it was immediate. It was just immediate. And it wasn't as though that was an anomaly. It just kept on going up from there. So I'll tell you, I paid $18,000 for my Enigma machine in 2002. And now they're selling for, as you can see, much higher. You can see 440 is the record for a 3-wheel, 860 for a 4-wheel, and this 3/4 size machine I was talking about, 670,000. Yes?
Yeah, were the Enigmas ever used on our diesel boat submarines? Did we have the same like the German U-boats, or do you know anything about that?
What we would use? Yeah. Is that the question? Yeah. Well, we had different machines. Okay, so one of the problems with the Germans was they used the Enigma for most everything. I mean, they used it in their subs, in their boats, on their planes, on all Army locations. The U.S. used a weaker cipher. Okay, it was called the M209, and it didn't use electricity. It was a little bit cumbersome to use, but this is what most of the Army used for a battlefield cipher, and they knew that the Germans could break it, and we thought that they could break it in about a week. And after the war, we found out that's roughly true, that they could break it in about a week. But we were just hoping to keep the news from them for the day of the battle. So the other messages that were sent by, for the admirals, generals, back to Roosevelt or Churchill, all those kind of things. Those were all encrypted with a different device. Okay, now the English had a device called a Type X, which is much like the Enigma. Okay, and the Germans never broke the Enigma, so they didn't break the Type X either. But the U.S. had a different machine that had 15 wheels. 5 wheels would change the letters, and then the other 10 wheels were used to make those 5 wheels move irregularly. And that was never broken, and it was even used after the war. It was called the Sigaba. So you can see the record prices here, but it's also interesting to find sometimes a story like this, where a Romanian professor found a typewriter for 100 euros, immediately sold it on a Romanian website at auction for 45 euros, and then it sold 4 months later in the U.S. for 245. So, and so I guess I should clarify, 245 is probably about the going price even today. You occasionally see some go over 300, but a lot of it depends on the condition. So if the condition is good, it's going to get more. There was one that was on auction just last week, which didn't sell because the high price was $200,000 and the seller didn't want to sell it. But it was in bad shape. It had rust on it, and when it was found, it didn't have a plug board, so they cobbled on a plug board from another machine, and it didn't have a wood case, so they got a wood case from a different machine. So it was kind of not as as pure as you might say as what's desired. Yes.
What are your long-term plans for your machine? I'm not interested in buying. I'm just curious.
Oh, okay. Well, I have another machine actually. So this machine that sold for $440, it's a 3-rotor machine, but it has the metal case. So the inside looks the same, but they use the metal case ones in the Air Force, because on a plane the wood would just crack up from the shaking. And it turns out there's only about maybe 16 of those. And so when one came up and was offered to me, it was hard for me to resist. But I had to pay a little more than $18,000 for it. But I bought that. So I have 2 Enigma machines, and I have a cipher collection, I would say, that starts with the first cipher device I have is from a book from 1561, I'm sorry. And it's the first book printed on the topic of ciphers. And I have about 100 different cipher machines, including, from many different countries. And so it's in my museum in my home. My plan is to give it to my youngest son, who is also interested, but he works, so he doesn't. You know, I didn't get into any of this until I retired. It's just hard to spend a lot of time on such a crazy thing like this until you're retired. But he has an interest, and you know, he follows along with my crazy stories, and so and he lives nearby, so I think that's where it's going. I've thought about also donating it to different museums. My biggest concern is I want it to be on display. You know, I don't want it to be hidden in a warehouse somewhere. You know, that's the only thing. Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to see if possible, because I'm involved with a lot of the museums in Northern California. Maybe the Air Museum up in Vacaville would be a good place for it, or other museums, so people can see it and make a difference. And you know about VFW posters?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
About a library for medal of honor recipients. I started that.
Oh.
You know who I am. My name is Leroy John Adams. I'm the great-grandson of John Adams and John Quincy Adams.
Oh, wow.
I'm the Presidential Eagle Scout. I would like to see you donate some of your stuff to your museum. For the younger people, we're all old in the room. I would like to see the younger people see what it's all about.
Yeah, I agree. And so I give this talk all over the Bay Area, or similar, you know, and I take my Enigma machine to everything from radio clubs to computer clubs to social organizations and so forth. I also have I volunteer at the Computer History Museum, where I know the chief curator there, and they come and visit my museum occasionally. And so he has an Enigma machine already, so he doesn't really need another one.
Yeah, I'd like to work with your son to get it out in America. I'm the Area 1 chaplain, and I closed down the shipyard with Portugosi with Captain Calvin. I'd like to see the stuff that young people understand and get involved, because this is what America is all about. And I'm only blessed because I had some of the best mentors in the country.
Yeah. No, thank you. I've got my business card up here. I'd encourage you to come and take a card and call me. I know Doug mentioned books. I did bring a few books. This is not really a plug. Please don't buy the book. You know, it's just a book of what's in my collection, and I describe a little bit about crypto wars, about each category of machine. It's available on Amazon for $20. I'll sell it to you for my cost. No shipping, no tax. $15 is what it cost me, and it's signed. So if you'd like it, you're welcome to that. One other thing I should point out is I mentioned this patent drawing that was done by Scherbius. This is the real patent. This is the patent from Berlin. Okay, this is not a replica. This is the real thing. And I said it's an exact copy of the Hugo Koch patent. So this is written in German, and the reason I know this is the one from Berlin is there's a stamp on here with the Polish patent office. So half of the patents from Berlin were sent to Poland in World War II for protection. The other half were sent to a salt mine way underground in Germany, and this is one that went to Poland. And then after the war, somehow it got on an auction site, so I bought it. And so there's like 6 pages of text, and then there's 10 drawings. And these are engineering drawings, and the scale is different than the Hugo Koch, but if you just scale it up, they exactly match the Hugo Koch drawings. And for anybody that's an engineer knows that's impossible, you know, without the collaboration. Yes.
You may not want to talk about it, but I do know in World War II we were also able to decode the Japanese.
Yes.
And was that through the same type of system? Do you want to
Yeah, the Japanese, there were 2 main things that they used. One was a code book, and yes, we broke the code book, and that was used by the Navy. But the ones that was like the Enigma was a machine called the Purple. Now the difference in the Purple, actually it's the only machine we know of that it didn't use a rotor, it used a telephone stepping switch. So if you're familiar with the telephone stepping switch, it just, the nice thing about that is you can buy those off the shelf, and they work very reliably. And so what it would do is it would mix the consonants. So it took the Japanese letters and turned it into, the English letters, and it turned the consonants to a consonant and a vowel to a vowel. And that was how it was broken, even though it took over a year for the U.S. to break it. And then they ended up making a replica machine that they could break it in real time, because they tended to change the settings only every 15 days. But every day in between, they changed it in a regular way that we could figure out. And so we were able to read those messages. And where that really came into play was there was a Japanese ambassador in Berlin called Baron Oshima. He was a 2-star general by the end of the war, and he was a personal friend of Hitler, which seems odd because he is a Japanese guy. He's in Berlin, and he made really good friends with Hitler. So Hitler gave him free rein. He could go to anywhere. And he, just about 2 weeks before D-Day, he went to all of the locations that we were going to look at or attack, and he gave a 29-page report back to Tokyo on the German fortifications. And the important thing that he told him was that a lot of the German tanks were going to stay back at Calais, because Hitler thought that's really where the battle was going to take place. And so he was most fearful of the general, who was the general that in World War II, Patton. Yeah, he was most fearful of Patton. And so Patton was taken offline. He was given this fictitious army called U.S. Army 1 or something, and they laid, fake oil lines. They had blow-up tanks and ships and things. And so Hitler really thought that's where the battle was going to be. And all of that deception took place because we thought that if we could delay him by 3 or 4 days in Calais, and that would give us a stronghold on D-Day on the beach, and then we could go in from there. Well, it turns out it delayed him for 2 weeks. So that was a gift that after 2 weeks it was already too late. And that was all that was due to breaking the Japanese. It wasn't the Enigma, because they weren't relaying this information, but this information we knew came from a very close relationship between Oshima and interestingly, none of those machines exist. The Japanese were very good about destroying them. There's half of one of those machines that exist. And where it existed was in a hole outside the Japanese embassy in Berlin that was used to send those 29, that 29-page message. And so it's at the NSA Museum. Yes?
As a follow-up to my previous question, a message is made with that enigma and then is sent in paper form. Somebody else has a similar identical enigma, and you have to send the wheels in a particular pattern.
Yes.
Decipher?
Yes.
Okay.
And typically that would be what would be called a net. So the Air Force would have a few different networks, like they might have one for the Mediterranean area, one for Northern Europe, and so forth. The Army, might in different countries have different settings, but the settings involve the 3 rotors and the plug boards, and then for each message, the operator would just turn the wheels to whatever setting randomly that they want to send it to. But that means that everybody in that network can decipher that message. Yes. And typically, at the beginning of the war, the U-boats, for instance, they all had the same settings. But as you got into the war, and by the time they came out with the 4-wheel Enigma, every U-boat had a separate message, separate setting. And it was double encoded for the U-boat commander that had his own settings a second time. So it would be coded twice, and the second time with a setting that only the commander had to decipher. So if they had something specific to send to that commander, they made sure that even the U-boat, the Enigma operators couldn't decode it.
Did that mean that the commander had to decode it himself?
Yeah, he did, and that's what he did. Yeah, and it's and actually the Allies decoded some of those messages too, because we had some of because once we decoded the message and we knew, and then there's another coding, then we just send it through again and decode again. Yes.
So I'm assuming with a modern computer that these machines with the mechanical parts are obsolete.
Mm-hmm.
Can you make some kind of connection how we get from Enigma to encryption today?
Yeah, the encryption today is completely different. So first of all, we have in '76. If you've heard the guy named Whitfield Diffie, he lives here in the Bay Area. I've met him many times at different crypto meetings. He invented something called public key encryption. And what that means is that he came up with a way that you can simultaneously send a message to someone publicly and yet ensure that the message could not be broken, at least with, depending on how many numbers you want to have in this. And, today it's up to 2 to the 4,000, so, it would take the fastest computer basically forever. And in fact, they calculate the computer would have to be larger than the number of atoms in the universe to break this in any kind of real time. But the other part is that once we come up with quantum computing, we'll be able to break that immediately. Immediately, as long as it's a big enough quantum computer, within a second. So the other way that we encrypt is through something that is different than this. It's called stream ciphers, where you need a key, and the key is normally sent by this method I just described, because you can send, rather than me sharing a key with somebody, how do we share that secretly? Well, we share it with public key encryption, which is very strong, but then that key is used to encode a different message using a stream cipher. And the reason for that is the stream cipher is much more efficient computer-wise, so you can have a very long cipher in it, and it doesn't take a lot of computer resources. And so basically it's a way to make it as random as possible. The only way to really have it random and unbreakable is to use a one-time pad. So if you truly have a random set of letters or numbers, and you take a message and you mix it with that random set of letters, you have what truly is an unbreakable cipher. But the problem is, how do you transmit that unbreakable cipher to somebody? In World War II, we did it because we make tapes and send it to ships, and if a ship were captured, it would be dropped in the ocean, and it's in a heavy metal container, and so it would sink, and they weren't worried about it. But in normal day-to-day transactions like you and I do on the computer, that's really not practical. And so what we use is, AES, it's called, things like that, which are a stream cipher, still very strong. And even after quantum computers, those kind of ciphers will still be strong and can still be used. But then the question becomes, how do we transmit the key then for that? Well, quantum computers may come to the answer there too, because they have this thing called quantum entanglement that allows you to send something to another person that it can't be intercepted, or if it is, it ruins the key. And so by using quantum entanglement, we'll get rid of PKE, but we'll replace it with something even stronger called quantum entanglement. Yes?
So when the USS Pueblo was captured,
Yeah.
any backstory on that?
That was a terrible thing. The USS Pueblo, that was was that late 60s? I don't remember the exact.
I thought it was late 60s.
Late 60s, yeah. Yeah, 68, okay. Yeah, basically the types of encryption machines that they were using, believe it or not, were already stolen because of spies in the U.S. military, that the Russians already knew it. So the North Koreans took this and they sold it, of course, to the Russians. But the Russians had already broken these ciphers. They already knew. And so it caused us to no longer use, those particular cipher types. But it was, the timing could not have been worse, first of all.
We lost more than just cryptography. We had a single sideband underwater telephone that was declassified right after levels.
Yes, right. And of course, it just laid bare all of what we were doing in terms of, receiving signals and decoding them and what we could work on to decode. It was, talk about a terrible situation. You don't want them knowing what we're doing, but we also don't want them knowing what we know that they're doing, because it causes them to then change their encryption methods.
I find it interesting that, as a civilian, I was sworn to secrecy when I go to prison.
Yeah.
Yet, military, sailors included, tend to just gab about everything.
Is that right? Well, that's
read some books and see some movies.
I know that's been the case. It's a terrible story that would happen. I agree with you. I'm not sure what more to say about that. It's
It's rhetorical.
Yeah, you know more than I do on that. Although I happen to live in an area where who was that naval guy that was a spy?
Explain that. We'll bring that next. Warrant Officer Walker.
Walker. He had dead drops within a couple of miles of my house when I lived in Maryland, and it was in the back roads there. And I remember reading about this and saying, "Wait a minute, I know that road," and I'd look it up, and it's only a couple of miles from my house. It was some back road little pathways that between where I lived and the river. Yes, thank you. I couldn't even imagine that that's all that was going on there.
I'm going to go buy a book or two.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and then people can come up and talk.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Please come up and take a look, and I'll open it up and show you how the German soldiers would have to change the wheels and all that good stuff.